Hey everybody and welcome. Today's mini make truly is a super mini make, as spoiler alert, it only has 2 seams. I bought this pair of pashmina shawls a couple years ago now, I think it was, and they have been sitting in my stash waiting for this project. And since it's getting a little cooler and I've got an event coming up, I figured I might as well do this now so I have them. I can't say for certain if these really long rectangular shawls were still popular in the 1840s, but honestly, I'm not really concerned about that. I will definitely be able to use this with Regency costumes, and you know, they'll be nice and warm, so that's why I'm working on this right now. Initially, I thought the tags were actually sewn on to the shawl, but no, I was wrong. They were stuck on with basically double-sided super sticky tape, which was a real pain to get off and meant that I needed to do some wiggling to get the threads back into place once I had peeled the tape with the tag off. Because of how loosely woven these shawls are, I wasn't able to perfectly get all of the warp and weft threads back into place, but you have to look pretty close to see where the tags were once I did get them, you know, less stretched out. As you can see, I am kind of holding it slightly on the diagonal and just wiggling my hands back and forth to close up the spots that opened up as I pulled the tag off. I took the tag off of the other scarf or shawl as well, and then I was ready to move on to the next step, which is sewing the two of them together. I decided I wanted to keep the darker side as the quote-unquote right side or outside of the shawls, so I have the darker sides together and the orange will be the inside of the shawl. And all I'm doing is, rather than sewing right at the edge where the fringe is, I am going to be sewing along the line of the pattern within the shawl to try and help hide the join somewhat. It will be somewhat noticeable no matter what I do, just because there's going to be the extra layers of fabric that are the seam allowance there, so it's impossible to get it completely hidden, but I can still get it pretty close. And all I'm doing is just a running stitch interspersed occasionally with the back stitch. As I mentioned before, this is a really loosely woven fabric, so I'm not even worrying about making super tiny stitches, just because of how, again, how loose the weave is and how low the thread count is within the shawl. And once I had stitched it, I gave it a quick press, opening it up so that I could then fell the seam from the other side. And as you can see, the join just about disappears, although I was a little bit off in one spot. Again, I'm not really worried about it. It does kind of disappear into the pattern. So after giving it a quick press, all I need to do is trim down the the seam allowance now, and I am using pinking shears, although I don't know if I really needed to. I did leave myself a fairly wide seam allowance. This border here is about 3 inches to start with, so I'm leaving myself almost 1.5 inches of seam allowance there, and then I'm just going to roll it into a and fell it down to cover, and this is to make sure that it doesn't fray out too much, because again, super loose weave, which is what gives it that nice drapey effect. So all I have to do next is just sew down along the fold like any other type of, or like your normal felled seam. So I just pinned my rolled seam allowance down, and then I'm going to sew it again with basically a running stitch, occasionally interspersed with the back stitch just to give it a little extra stability. This is not heavy, or the shawl doesn't weigh much, and it's not a stress bearing seam, so I wasn't really worried about getting really tight perfect stitches. I did whip stitch over the ends, as you can see here, just along the edges to keep the seam allowance inside from poking out. And then I just, as I said, I stitched down the other half of the felled seam. And that is the entire process. I started out with a pair of shawls that were 28 inches wide and 72 inches long each. And now that I'm done, I have one giant shawl that is about 138 inches long. It's not quite the full 144 inches because I did cut out a little bit from the middle when I did join them. But still, it's almost 12 feet long. That's a heckin' big shawl, huh? I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you all for watching.